Withology is about collaboration, inspiration, dedication, influence, and positive manifestation. It's about the stories behind success, something everyone needs a little bit of help achieving. Join host Brian Tierney, CEO of Brian Communications, as he interviews the most successful business and industry leaders to hear the fascinating stories about their personal journeys and the people who have helped them get to where they are today. Welcome to Withology.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Withology. I'm Brian Tierney, CEO of Brian Communications, and today I'm joined by radio and television host and New York Times bestselling author and good friend Michael Smerconish. With over 30 years in talk radio, Michael is currently the host of the Michael Smerconish program on SiriusXM, as well as Smerconish on CNN. With a combination of a passion for politics and a few serendipitous encounters, Michael has built a highly successful career interviewing some of the world's most influential people and tackling some of the most controversial topics. He's an established author, and his books have made their way onto the New York Times bestseller list. He also has a new feature-length film called Things I Wish I Knew Before I Started Talking, which is just now available on a bunch of different platforms, Amazon, Apple, you name it. Michael, I'd like you to give me a little more details on that, where instead of doing a tour, which he was planning to talk about his 30 years in broadcasting, he did it from a theater in this COVID environment, and it's quite entertaining. So worth watching. And I've known Michael since like late 80s, and you're kind enough to say that I was helpful in your getting your start in broadcasting. Why don't we start with that? Start with me on the Withology part.
Well, you deserve all the credit or all the blame.
Credit. One
or the other, because it was May 19, 1990. You were a guest host on 96.5 FM WWDB, and you invited me to be your guest. So I was the guest of a guest host the first time that I was on Philadelphia radio, and I was totally smitten with it. And I do, Brian, say that was really the beginning of my radio career, something that I noted recently and which became the special that you were referencing. But when I stop and think about where did it all begin and how did it all begin, for better or worse, it's with you.
It's for better. It is amazing how, your life, my life too, and that's why the whole theme of this podcast is Withology, because nobody does it. We talk about sociology and psychology. I call it Withology because none of us does it alone. It's with other people. And, I've also got a quote in my office. It's from Ovid. It was written, I think, 15 BC. Chance is always possible. Let your hook always be cast. When you least expect it, you will find a fish. And your life has had those aspects as well, too. Let's start, though, in the early days. Talk about early life, mentorship. What was it like as a young man? Talk about growing up in the Doylestown, Bucks County area a little bit.
Well, I think I had a pretty normal and happy upbringing in the suburbs of Philadelphia in Doylestown. That's where I was born and raised, and I went to the Central Bucks Public Schools K through 12. My father was a teacher, social studies teacher turned guidance counselor. Mom raised my brother and me, and then began an incredible career in real estate that continues to this day. But along the way, what was significant is that I attended a junior high school called Hollycong, and Hollycong Junior High School was brand new and had a closed circuit television system in it. So morning announcements were not the conventional public address or PA system. No, we had a small television studio in the school, and it would beam to homeroom morning announcements. And I always wanted to be on that television station and involved in the production and so forth. I frankly never made the cut, but I got a taste. I got a taste of the television business through that. And then here in Philadelphia, KYW News Radio has always been the AM radio giant. Kind of interesting because they're now migrating to FM. And they had an internship program in my senior year. Well, frankly, Brian, it's been going on since I was a senior in high school, and it continues to this day. It's called News Studies. And for a couple of weeks, I had the opportunity to spend some time in the KYW news and television studios. And so the combination of the junior high school television studio, and then the internship at KYW, plus my political involvement, is really the origin of where I am today. It's kind of funny because, to your point about Withology, it looks in my case like it was all according to plan and like it all fell into place very neatly. But of course, that's not the way that life is. You know, you're quoting something, I'll quote something. John Lennon, who said, "Life is what happens to you when you're busy making other plans."
Yeah.
And in my case, you know, things just evolved, but met a trajectory in the end.
You know, you're hitting on something too, because one of the things that I talk about, my own background too, is let's give it a shot. Who knows? Let's try to figure this out and try to do it, and getting out in the community. And so many often people are fearful. Well, how about and like, you know, let's untie the boat from the dock, because the boat's meant to leave the harbor. So let's see what happens. Let's try to avoid extreme risk. But at the same time, let's get out there. Your mom is this incredibly successful, as you say, today, realtor. Your dad, who passed, I think, in 2018, he's a high school teacher in guidance counselor, and he also is teaching in prisons GED to inmates. I mean, that's a really beautiful upbringing. I mean, that's pretty amazing.
Well, it's kind of funny also because my father, who was in charge of that, you're right, GED program at the Bucks County Prison, which was affectionately known in those days as the Pine Street Hotel. Today it's the Michener Center, and it houses beautiful art. But we, you know, our home, Brian, was 3-bedroom, 1 bath, no shower till I was in the 8th grade. And whenever we would get a significant improvement to our house, it was a kitchen and it was a bathroom and also our rec room. When each of those projects was undertaken, it was an inmate on work release.
Okay.
And it's really funny because one of the guys that I remember who built our rec room was named Coleman Foley. I thought that was the coolest name. And one of my books is a novel called Talk. And in it, there's a character. Now he's a congressman, Coleman Foley.
Oh, that's sweet.
That's where it comes from.
That's sweet. And is that how, you know, and your dad at one point decided to run for office, right? Is that kind of how, or were you just interested in it before that, or does that kind of tip?
Well, I was kind of interested in it, but in the spring of my high school year at Central Bucks West, there was an open seat in the Pennsylvania State Legislature, and my father, who'd been involved in the community but never politically involved, decided he was going to run for this open seat and entered a Republican primary. And I became completely consumed with his campaign. My entire second half of my senior year in high school, I was all wrapped up in my dad's election. He lost, but for me, it was a great beginning of experiences to come.
Yeah, it's just, I always had an interest in politics. And when I was 17, I got a mailer that in Delaware County, a very similar kind of spot in Springfield, there was an election up. They were looking for people to run for township commissioner. And I was going to be 18 by the election. So I thought, what a great way to learn about politics. So the first time I voted, I was able to vote for myself. I also lost, but in true Delaware County Republic, they got that Democrat to flip and he became a Republican later on. So yeah, but you get that bug and that being out there. And then in that same serendipity, so there's this legendary guy named Larry Kane, who was on WPVI back then. It was the lead anchor, and then later went to New York. He's had an incredible role, a mentorship, I should say, or he's been an inspiration. And you met him by doing work for a pool company at his house and doing pool maintenance. Talk about that a little.
We grew up at 24 Mercer Avenue, and at 42 Mercer Avenue, which was about 6 houses away, were the Stockles. The Stockles had the only in-ground pool on our street. So consequently, we called it Stockle Valley Country Club. It's kind of funny because they were at a dip in the road, and we were all the kids in the neighborhood. And it was a wonderful street on which to grow up, but we would always hang at the Stockles. The parents, Mike and Arlene Stockle, he was a former Sylvan Pools contractor who went out on his own and opened up a pool company. And then Arlene, who was really the entrepreneur in the family, started a patio furniture business. And they put it all together. They were located in our neighborhood, and it was called Mountain Lake Pool and Patio. And one of the customers was Larry Kane, who was then living in Huntington Valley in Rydell, Pennsylvania, which was a little bit of a hike from Doylestown. When I was 16 and 17, my summer job was to deliver patio furniture, to deliver pool supplies for the Stockles. And one day, Mr. Stockel gave a prized assignment to me. It was frankly just a 3x5 card, and it said, take chlorine to Larry Kane's house, and it had the address. Well, the Stockles had a son 2 years younger than me, Mike Stockel. We're still friends to this day. And the two of us together in a panel truck had a couple of buckets of chlorine and I think some pH riser, whatever the hell that is, in the back of the truck. And we go to Larry Kane's house, all excited to meet him. But a woman who was working in a domestic capacity answered the door instead of Larry. And she said, oh, just, put the chlorine out in the pool shed. And we're like, oh, no. And Brian, I don't know how I came up with this, but I said, Mr. Kane must sign the bill of lading. And I, to this day, don't even know what a bill of lading is, but it sounded official, and it worked with her. So the next thing that happens is Larry Kane comes to the door. He has no shirt on. He's wearing Bermuda shorts, and his fly is down. And it occurs to me that he must have been doing the New York evening news, probably, 11 to 11:30 by the time he gets back to Rydell. Now, here are these two punks on his doorstep. And what's even worse is before he knew what hit him, we had one of the old Instamatic cameras that you would take a picture and it would go like, zhuzh, and out would spit this image. You'd have to shake it for 15 seconds, and then it would develop right in front of your eyes. So the two of us each passed the camera and had our picture taken with Larry Kane. I'd never met him before. He really was a big celebrity in our area. And Larry would end up being a critically important mentor for me. In fact, I just got a note from him this week talking about the release of the film, and he was so
how beautiful.
Complimentary, but he was wonderful to me. And I've always tried to pay that forward because of individuals like Larry who provided that for me. When young people ask me about broadcasting or politics, I always try to extend myself and do likewise.
Yeah, and it's just, again, you just never know, but it's that having the courage, if you will, or let's give it a shot, and that's what you did that day. But you did magic shows too when you were a kid. Is that what you enjoyed doing?
Well, I don't know if you remember Doug Henning, but
Sure.
In the 70s, Doug Henning was on Broadway. I never got to see it, but the success of this live performance on Broadway touched off a magic craze all across the country. The local malls in the Philadelphia area all had magic stores. They cropped up out of nowhere, and it was like the pet rock or the yo-yo. It was a big phase that kids were going through. But in my case, I took it to a different level. I actually did shows, and I would get paid $5 a show. And I didn't know it at the time. It wasn't my plan at the time, but the experience of speaking in front of individuals, also getting razzed. I mean, believe me, there reached a point in my magic career where I would turn down birthday parties if they were like 12 to 16, because I knew they were going to be such a pain in my ass that it wasn't going to be worth it to go through, and endure all the heckling. But a great experience. And, compulsive me, I kept a diary.
Did you really?
Really funny to go back, and because I tell you how many people and what did I get paid and what tricks worked and which ones didn't. It's really funny, and I'm so glad to have recently discovered that little spiral notebook.
Oh, isn't that great? So my wife, particularly when the kids were little, kept a diary every day. I always talk about doing it, but haven't done it. So you did that, huh?
In my magic days. I wish I'd done it later in life, but in my magic days, I did.
Yeah. And you went to Lehigh, right, for college,
Right.
And then you went to law school at Penn, and you were practicing law and doing some real estate type things. That's kind of what I remember. You were part of that title insurance company, I think, when I had like 2 clients, and you were my third, I think, way back then. And
True. You got a nice spread in the Business Journal. Well done, Brian.
And then, and so at what point did you say, because I remember you were filling in, I filled in occasionally. I found it was a lot of hard work, and you had a passion for it. So you were taking the midnight shifts, the this shifts, the that shifts.
True.
Talk about that, being willing to just, put your hand up. Yes, I'll do that.
There was a lot going on in the 90s, I guess, in my world, in that I got married. My wife and I began a family. Before all was said and done, we have 4 children.
That's great.
I was practicing law with a legendary trial lawyer named James E. Beasley. That was a wonderful experience, and we were together. I worked for him for a decade. But going back to the to the 1990 experience with you, I built on that and initially was a guest and then was a guest host and then was given my own program at different times. For example, the first show that I had that was my own was Sunday night. And then I went to Saturday morning and then Saturday and Sunday morning and then an hour and afternoon drive and then 2 and then 3 and then morning drive. So I was juggling a lot of responsibilities at one time, but there did come a break point. And the break point was actually when Don Imus was let go in Philadelphia. Mel Karmazin, who had run CBS and was close to Imus, was always perceived to be his protector. And so I was doing an hour or two Monday through Friday an afternoon drive in Philadelphia. And they always said to me, if we could ever get permission from corporate to shake up the lineup, we'd want you to be our morning guy. And that day finally came and they asked, and I had to make a decision, consulted with Beasley. He was very, very supportive. Talked it over with my wife and decided, okay, instead of being a lawyer who on the side is a radio host, I'll be a radio host who happens to be a lawyer.
That's the commitment level. Yeah.
Right.
Back then, too, when you were just starting out, talk radio was really interesting because it was about personalities. It wasn't like it was today. You know what I mean? You had people like Irv Homer, who we knew, and things like this. So when you talked about those Sunday night shows, I remember calling up friends and saying, do me a favor, can you call the station? I'm not kidding. Yeah, Amen. You remember that? It's kind of, and there's Bob from Bala Cynwyd. Hey, Bob, how are you? Hey, Brian, I really love your show all the time. I thank you very much, Bob. Anyway, but now it's so different, isn't it? I mean, it's so divisive. It used to be entertaining. And why is it the conversation is so angry nowadays?
Well, let me go back and just support what you said a moment ago, because the radio station that we're both referencing was 96.5 FM WWDB. The tagline was the talk station. And it was a hodgepodge of personalities. Irv Homer, who you mentioned, was a libertarian. I don't think I knew what that meant at the time. Frank Ford was a doctrinaire liberal. Paul W. Smith was a conservative, centrist type.
That's
Dominic
right.
Quinn was a conservative, but we knew him for his command of the English language. And I'll bet you remember Susan Bray, the saucy Aussie, right? She had a husky voice and she was from down under. So she was the saucy Aussie. But they weren't there because of any ideology or political commonality. They were there to make the phone rings. And when I first came in, I was told that's your job. Your job is make those phones ring and engage in conversation. Nobody ever told me that politically the show needed to be driven one way or another. Mm-hmm. And that was not just our radio station, which was owned by Chuck and Susan Schwartz, but it was radio stations all across the country. What changed things was Rush Limbaugh getting syndicated in 1991, because now he established AM talk radio as a conservative clubhouse. By the way, I happen to think that was needed because the media was then a left of center place. The question is, why has that model been sustained all these years, even after the advent of the internet, even after cable television, satellite radio, and so on and so forth? But it does not resemble the business when I first came in, so much so that the reason I came to SiriusXM 7 years ago was really to escape that very doctrinaire programming where every show is the same except the host changes.
Yeah, but it is a shame. You know, I call myself a Tom Ridge Republican, and I know you're an independent now. It's that common ground part of it that really seems to be. And I also feel like, don't you feel like there's more people in this broad common ground than there are on the extremes, although they just don't seem to have the same voice as loud?
I do believe that. Yeah, I do believe that. I think the problem is that the people we're talking about in the very polarized forms of media, they have outsized influence because those centrists and independent thinkers are not as engaged as they are. And passion, unfortunately, controls this game. And so many politicians on the left, on the right, are taking their cues from individuals with media platforms who are doctrinaire. You and I are having this conversation, amidst the aftermath of the 2020 election. And when you look at the support that President Trump enjoyed from so many Republicans in office for so long, even after it was clear that the race was over, part of the answer, I think, is because they're fearful of their base. And their base can get turned on by Trump or by their favorite media personality. I see a lot of overlap between President Trump and his appeal and that of, say, Rush Limbaugh.
Yeah. Come back to people who have had amazing impact. We talked about your dad. We talked about Larry King and your producer, TC, who's been working with you. How many years have you guys worked together, you and TC now?
15 or 16.
And you met her. She was Harvard, all that, but your kids went to the same Montessori school?
No, it's better than that. Met her in the drop-off line because she was the teacher's assistant for the teacher who had all four of our kids.
Wow.
And she was very engaging, very bright, very personable. All the parents loved her in that role. And so our kids were being educated at the local Montessori school where she was very much involved in their care. And then somehow, and I don't know exactly how it happened, but she was invited to be an on-air salesperson at QVC. And there was one particular product that she started selling that she was like knocking it out of the park. They were candles, flameless candles. And so she got a little taste of the media bug by selling those flameless candles. And to go back to where I was a moment ago, when the radio station finally was able to get rid of Don Imus and invite me to host in mornings, which was really, big time, for me. So I needed a producer. And I hired a producer who on paper looked ideal. He was a guy who'd been in the business and he knew the technical side, but we just didn't get along, and he was not very personable. And I kept thinking, like, boy, TC is so nice, so competent, loves the media exposure that she's getting. I wonder if she would ever view herself as a radio producer. She came into the studio. Here's a great life lesson for you, Brian. She came into the studio and was taken with the radio world. But CBS wouldn't give me permission to hire her. She tells a story infamously. So she has a meeting with the program director one day, and the program director is looking at her resume, and she throws it across the table to TC's. What the f*** makes you think I'd hire you based on this? Your Harvard degree? You're a Montessori teacher. But I was insistent, and they took a chance. And, there's a lot to be said for taking competence over paper qualifications, because she's exceptional and everybody, I think, knows that. And she really took to it and ended up being one of the best professional moves that I ever made in terms of bringing her into the fold.
Was it hard? I mean, when you said to her, hey, have you ever thought about doing this? Was it like, were you crazy for her, or how did she?
You know what? I think she was ready for a change. Yeah. I think that I made the appeal, the pitch, right at a moment where her eyes were getting opened, that maybe she didn't want to be in education the rest of her life. What exactly did she want to do? And she, in the same way that I was, I guess, when I came on your radio program in 1990, she was kind of taken with it the first time she walked into the studio. And she was almost like a squatter, because she just came in and kept showing up every day. And it wasn't burdensome to me. I loved having her there, but the radio station finally just waved the white flag. Like, okay, Michael thinks this is what he ought to do. Let's see. And it worked out.
Yeah. That's such a great point. And you try to, especially in this environment where you can get discouraged at times. And if you're with other people, is the theme of Withology, if you're working with other good people, great things can happen that you didn't expect to possibly happen.
Well, I accept that, but there were so many near misses. And for me, as I look back, and this film forced me to go back and recreate a timeline and understand what had gone right and what had gone wrong. Believe me, there were many more failures and positions, jobs, shifts that did not come through that I thought, frankly, I had earned than there were those that did. Everybody remembers, well, okay, so you then became the morning man after Imus. Well, that's true. And you got the gig at CNN or Sirius XM. Yes. But let me tell you about 10 different things that didn't pan out, pilots that didn't get picked up,
right,
hosts for whom I worked 5 years as their principal fill-in that didn't pan out, et cetera, et cetera. I think this business in particular, the media business, you need to be willing to sustain a lot of rejection.
Yeah. Yeah, it really is. I see this in terms of news talent too. Lots of times, folks, you get into a certain period of your career too, you're wondering, are they going to be thinking they could get somebody cheaper than me, who, right, all that sort of thing. Who's been your most memorable guest over all the years?
No one that would be a household name. In other words, I've been very fortunate to conduct interviews with presidents, athletes, celebrities
Obama,
Yeah.
Castro. You had dinner with
Yeah.
Castro, for Pete's sake, in Cuba. Yeah,
but they don't generally.
good cigars, or
Yes.
was it good?
Well, he
We'll get to it later.
gave me a box of cigars at the end of the night. I have to tell you that story. But those are not the best radio content that I've ever done. The best radio content that I do is more Seinfeldian, more Larry David-ish, where it doesn't matter if you're a liberal or a conservative. I'll give a great example because I'm going to do it this week. Can I tell you something I've got planned right now?
Yes.
Okay. I read a study recently. It was Wall Street Journal talking about how many people know their neighbors. And I don't know one of my immediate neighbors. I can't tell you the name of one of my immediate neighbors. And yet, when we began this conversation, I told you about the Stockles and what their street address was and my street address. And if you asked me who lived between you and the Stockles, I would say, well, let's see. It was the Schutz, the Haggertys, the Busers, Mrs. Parsonese, the Willies, and then the Stockles. Okay? So I saw this story and I thought, I have got to talk about this. Is it me? Do I live now in a nicer neighborhood where there's more space between the houses? Maybe. Is it that we're more insular and we don't hang out with our neighbors? Maybe. I know when I talk about this data and open the telephone lines, it'll be a great conversation about which everybody will have an opinion and a story and an anecdote in terms of whether we are becoming more distant. Now, that's going to be great radio, probably better radio than any one of my 7 or 8 Obama interviews. Oh, I felt like a big shot, especially when I walked out of the White House twice, having been one-on-one with the commander-in-chief. But were they great radio? Nah, not so much.
Well, talk about Wild Bill.
So Wild Bill Guinier was a member of Easy Company. Wild Bill and Babe, his best friend, 2 South Philly guys who lived blocks away from one another, didn't know each other at home, met when they were preparing for D-Day, training in England, and established this famous relationship that was dramatized by Steven Spielberg in Band of Brothers. Stephen Ambrose's Band of Brothers. Was it Spielberg or was it Tom Hanks? Whichever of the two of them did it, brought it to life, told their story.
Wow.
Now, that doesn't fit my mold of real people telling stories about what's going on in their lives, because Wild Bill was more of the celebrity by the time I got to him, although still a very humble and down-to-earth kind of guy. But that interview stands out in my mind when I had him in studio. I mean, here's a guy who lost his leg at the Battle of the Bulge, who dropped on D-Day and landed in Saint-Marie-Église. Just amazing. And then came home from the war and didn't talk at all about it.
When W. Bush was president, there was those who felt like, is Smerconish changing? Is he, becoming a Democrat now? Talk about your feelings about that and bin Laden and some of those sorts of things.
Well, I was on board for W in 2000. In 2004, when he was running for re-election against John Kerry, I was invited and agreed and hosted. I was the MC of his final Pennsylvania rally. It was in a cornfield in Bucks County, just off I-95 with 20,000 people. So I was still on the team in 2004, but less so than I had been in 2000. And a large part of my, the diminished support that I felt for that White House was that every year that went off the clock, bin Laden and Ayman al-Zawahiri were still out there alive. And it just seemed like we'd taken our eye off the ball. And instead we made this left turn and went into Iraq and weren't going after those who were responsible for the events of September 11th. And then on Donald Rumsfeld's watch, I was invited to be a military tourist for a week, where they took me and a small group of American citizens, not even media people, and they had us visit all the hot spots in the Middle East and be briefed by the absolute top echelon of the military brass and in all the branches of government. And I came home even more convinced that it was no longer about bin Laden. It was no longer about September 11, that the mission had completely shifted. And that's why when in 2007, I had the opportunity for the first time to interview Senator Obama, and talk to him about the hunt for bin Laden, he said things that really opened my eyes about his willingness. This is interesting, Brian. In 2007, he's talking to me about his willingness to go into Pakistan to get bin Laden if that's where he's hiding, notwithstanding the sovereign status of Pakistan. And of course, that's how the story ended.
Right.
So it was really foreign policy. I mean, those events of September 11 really impacted me, even though I didn't lose anyone very close to me, but it was the seminal event of my life. I think remains so beyond weddings and births and so forth. It was the defining event. And I thought initially that Bush was handling it correctly, but as time went off the clock, less so. And that drove me to vote for Obama, and then admit it to my radio audience, because I never had to say anything, but I felt I owed it to them to say, here's what I did. And yeah, a lot of people were really pissed. In fact, some of them are angry, till today.
Yeah. Yeah. Talk about Castro. How did that come about? Meeting Fidel Castro.
So I was close to Senator Specter, and Senator Specter wrote a memoir called Passion for Truth, where he went back and relived his career, almost like Nixon did in his book. I think it was called Six Crises. And one of the chapters that Specter wrote about was his experience as a young prosecutor working on the Warren Commission. He very famously, I know you know this, came up with the single bullet theory, or he would force me to say later in life, the single bullet conclusion. And in writing his memoir, he made a trip to Cuba and spent time with Castro because he wanted to investigate with Castro the Cuban alleged involvement in the Kennedy assassination, which Specter didn't buy into and didn't buy into as of the time of his own passing. But I read the book and I interviewed him on radio about it. And I said, Cuba is a bucket list item for me. If you ever go back, please, let me know. Never expecting that he would call me in 2000, I guess going into 2001 at Christmas time. And he said, I am going back to Havana. I think I'm going to see President Castro, but I don't know for sure. And if your media credentials are intact and if you pay your own way, you can join me. And so that's how it came to pass that ultimately we were in Castro's company for more than 7 hours on a particular night. And it was one of the most surreal evenings, as you can imagine, in my life.
Oh, yeah. That goes back to let your hook always be cast, right? I mean, you never thought 10 years after you being my guest and I was the guest host that you'd be with Fidel Castro, a media celebrity star, it is pretty amazing. That's why I often try to remember and encourage others too. Don't get discouraged. You never know what's going to happen. Put it in a box, come to see what connections and the relationships can kind of get you to the next level. Well, Michael, thank you so much for being with me today with this podcast, Withology. Any final thoughts? Or
I wish you good things. And I appreciate the fact that we've known and been friends with one another for so long, because the experience of delivering the presentation, which you referenced, things I wish I knew before I started talking,
Yep.
caused me to do what too often in life we don't have time to do or purpose to do, which was go back and kind of assemble the path. And yes, Brian, if you had not invited me to be your guest when you were guest hosting, I really do believe that my life would have taken a different direction.
It would have been incredibly successful, but you would have had a different path. Yeah, it is. It's just two roads diverged in a yellow wood. I'll use another poet, a little more common than more recent Robert Frost. But Michael, it's a pleasure. Of course, you can check out the Michael Smerconish program every weekday 9 to noon on Sirius XM 124, as well as on Saturday mornings on CNN at 9 a.m. And also check out the new feature-length film, Things I Wish I Knew Before I Started Talking, which is now available on demand. Be sure to check it out because it's a very entertaining perspective, look back on Michael's life, but also the life of our country over the last 30-some years. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you.